today, as all of you know, this is going to be an opportunity for us to have a relatively participatory and interactive training workshop, which helps community organizers and activists identify and sort of discuss what they're seeing on the ground, as well as then how to message in your communities to help triage and stem the spread of misleading content and narratives. So I'm really thrilled to be here with a few partners of ours. We have been cooking up this programming for several weeks now, and I want to give a major shout out to our partners from All Voting is Local, Alianza, and for our future Florida. I'd love for each of our partners to be able to introduce themselves and a little bit of what they're seeing on the ground, sort of how they've come to this work. I will just say as background that PEN America has been working, researching and monitoring the threat of disinformation since 2016. And it has become, I think, embedded in almost everything you see when you check out the news now. It feels like a symptom of every aspect of our lives. So in the ways that we're able to engage our voting, civil rights, human rights, and civic engagement communities, we're so thrilled. So I want to turn it over to our partners to introduce themselves. Brad, can I call on you first to introduce All Voting is Local?
Sure. Thank you, Nora. As Nora said, I'm with All Voting is Local. My name is Brad Ashwell. I'm from Florida. I've been doing this work here for a couple of decades. All Voting is Local is a relatively new group. We work to eliminate discriminatory barriers to voting, particularly for marginalized communities and those most impacted by basically every law, Black, Hispanic, voters with disabilities, youth voters. So that's where we're coming from. This is a particularly important issue to me and our organization, because I mean, every conversation I've had with reporters or folks, when they've asked what the big issues were this last cycle with the elections, I mean, the two things that stuck out like sore thumbs for me was the vast array of different conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation that was going around like nothing we've ever seen. And I think the other would be, a close second would be voter intimidation. We haven't seen it on a scale like we saw this last cycle before. But misinformation was really the landmark issue. It was the big lie, the election was stolen. Starting almost a year and a half before the election, the lies about vote by mail being fraudulent and rife with problems, which were just wrong. Conspiracy, all the way down to conspiracy disinformation about socialists trying to steal votes and it being rigged from that perspective, and a lot of it specifically targeting the Hispanic community. So this issue is front and center to us, and I feel like I'm here to learn as much as to share our view from all of you. So thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Brad. I'll turn it to Ruben.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Ruben Lebron. I'm the political director for Alianza, and we are an organization dedicated to empowering the Latino community here in the state of Florida, and also to making sure that our democracy is thriving, it's inclusive, and accessible to everyone. Disinformation is going to be a big deal for us moving forward. It is a threat to our democracy. And after what happened in 2020, we're really thinking strategically about how we build power in our communities, how we build power for people of color, marginalized communities. And we cannot have those conversations anymore without talking about disinformation. We need to talk about it in the communication sense and in an organizing sense. But with communication, as you're going to hear from our folks, our partners from PEN America, it's not just a social media post. It's about intentionally, having a plan, building trusted messenger networks, talking to reporters, editorial meetings, a lot more, and organizing. We cannot forget that we need to have also a strategy for organizing to tackle this information. And that includes listening. Oftentimes in organizing campaigns, we make the mistake of being very prescriptive with our scripts and just talking, but we need to create listening systems in our organizing work so we can hear what disinformation is happening in our communities, how we can tackle that, how we can message and make sure people are getting the right information and have the access to vote. So I'm going to be telling this to everyone that is willing to hear it. we need to have a disinformation strategy, both on organizing work and on our communication side. So very happy to see everyone here, and let's continue having these conversations so we can be ready for 2021, 2022, and beyond as we do movement building everywhere.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruben. David, can I turn it over to you?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely really glad to be here. My name's David. I'm the regional director for the East Central Florida portion with For Our Future Florida. And really, of course, For Our Future, we do advocacy around a variety of progressive issues, really speaking to education, working families, policies that benefit the pay of working families, environmental protections, and racial social justice, among many others. And of course, for us, the key way of really moving the scale on these issues is organizing, and always love to have conversations and organizing. And when teams of volunteers or organizers are out in the field talking to people, having the opportunity to have the know-how to really confront and know how to approach, oftentimes very interesting conversations, but that are often riddled with elements of misinformation and disinformation, is something that I think is going to be really empowering to our organizers, really empowering to messaging and movement on the topics we're organizing around. So really glad to be here, looking forward to learning as much as anyone else here. So certainly very excited about this conversation, and really glad to be here.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to all of our partners. I don't want to waste any more time because we only have an hour, but I'd like to give you all just a very brief roadmap that following these introductions, we will provide what I call a flash training on mis and disinformation that my colleague Hannah Waltz and I will be leading together. And then we'd like to open it up for dialogue and really to hear from you all as to what you're seeing, what you're hearing. I think there is, at least in our work, a kind of moment where the awareness of misinformation as a concept has now kind of cracked open. And for organizers and activists, we are seeing so many questions around how can I best identify in my own life the practices to put in place, to recognize these narratives, and then how can all of you take that type of, the toolbox for yourselves and help bring forth a new way of engaging with communities, so that if people are sort of vulnerable to misleading narratives, or if they are thinking about a rumor they heard, how do you help talk with them in building a new narrative power? So once we open it up, we'll really hopefully build on some of the more solution and technique-oriented tools that we are discussing. But all of this is meant to be interactive. So if you have questions, if you have an idea that's sparked, please put it in the chat. I love seeing that everyone's introducing themselves. It's great to see all of you from many parts of the country. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it to Hannah Waltz, and she will begin by kicking us off with our training, our flash training.
Thanks, Nora. And yes, hi, everyone. I do want to echo, thank you so much for being here. We are really looking forward to hearing from you directly. If you would like to join in on the second part of this for our conversation discussion points, I just want to reiterate that we are recording the first half. We'll be turning the recording off for the second. So we hope you'll join in. All right. All right, so again, welcome to Empowering Communities On and Offline, how organizers can stem the spread of misinformation. So just to kick us off with some basics, we do like to differentiate between mis and disinformation. Disinformation, we always say, is used to manipulate public opinion. It has a lot of intention behind it to mislead And just to break down, a couple of the the vernacular that we kind of use with these, disinformation, false information, deliberately and often covertly spread with the intent to influence public opinion. Misinformation, less intention here, incorrect or misleading information not spread deliberately or intended to influence opinion. So this might be a friend or family member who is spreading information on Facebook with the intention to help inform those that they care about, without knowing that it's misleading, and it often stems from a disinformation campaign designed to create division. So we, as Nora mentioned, have been doing this work for the past year now, which is crazy. PEN America has, for a long time been looking at the proliferating effects of mis and disinformation. But in 2020, we really kicked off our media literacy work, and we started off working very closely with librarians who we often uplift as ambassadors of truth, and also local journalists, faith leaders, other community leaders. And that was, kind of our baseline for our media literacy work, and disseminating the messages of media literacy. And this year, we're really kind of zeroing more in on, we're continuing this work, but doing more kind of closed door sessions like today, with kind of grasstops leaders that can assist us in spreading the word about media literacy. And just want to, first of all, thank you and encourage you to continue this good work, because it doesn't happen without you. And I think another powerful part of this is understanding the why behind why media literacy, why disinformation campaigns work, and how they can kind of hack our brains. And so there are a few items that we can go through here on why we're susceptible to disinformation. It kind of levels the playing field in a way.
And I'll jump in just to sort of walk us through, in most of our much longer trainings, we spend considerable time talking about the mechanics of mis and disinformation. As Hannah mentioned, the times where there is a distinction between someone sharing something because they truly think they're helping their community. It could be some odd and unverified journal about COVID reactions. That is distinctly different than from how there are coordinated campaigns, really pushed by, promoted, crafted by bad actors to create division. And so a lot of your work, I would think, and I'm eager to hear about this, is likely predicated on the times where communities you work with are sharing misinformation. But they are susceptible to disinformation. And so the question we always get is like, well, why are we susceptible? And it's really good in this type of setting, when you're thinking about what the interactive elements of organizing are, to bring in that kind of emotional piece, to know that there are several layers to why we are susceptible. And so in our trainings that are much longer, usually we spend quite a bit of time talking about the psychology around this. And so we wanted to give you just a very brief rundown of some of the ways that we've identified susceptibility. I think the first is our emotions. If you will, think about the advent of the digital age. Think about how social media is now really pushing that we do a number of things. We can like something, we can dislike it. We can now care about people on Facebook and give them a hug. We can laugh at something. These are all really emotional reactions. And we lean into our emotionality when we're online. We have emotional reactions to information. I don't know about you, but every day I will read headlines on news websites that inflame and upset me. Sometimes things might be inspiring. But when you're in that state, when you're the most emotional in kind of reacting to information, it also then kind of has a domino effect. I know for me personally, when I see something really that evokes something, I want to share it. I want to kind of like get in on the conversation. And what we have found is that there's often this patina of credibility with mis and disinformation, the stuff that feels kind of real. And I'm not just talking about deep fakes, videos that actually do look like other people, but stories, headlines, various types of content that feel authentic. And you are not in a posture typically, unless you're really beginning to train yourself to do this, you're not in a posture to question and pause. You often, and I include myself, is we go online and we kind of, whether it's doom scrolling or just sort of boredom, we're just moving in kind of a passive way through what we see online. And a lot of times the most engaged stuff will be the most interesting. We know that disinformation also thrives on engagement. It thrives on the kind of clickbait-worthy headlines, the language that would incense. And sometimes that is due to inauthentic accounts, whether it is bots or other imposter accounts that boost what some post might really otherwise not have been engaged with much. So it might look like there have been a lot of shares of a post, a lot of comments, a lot of likes or laughter or anger. And this often, I know I speak for myself, can play into why I want to look at something. I will want to look at it because it's the most shared thing I'm seeing. And unfortunately, we don't have much access into what the platforms are doing currently. Whenever we ask for, as sort of experts in civil society, data around what impressions people have on content, we don't get that from the platforms. So it's only just that we're able to kind of guesstimate what we're really dealing with. But we know that often we come to our online experience emotional. We lean into that often because of just the passive way we engage with information. And all of that can be enhanced by both this credibility of like the patina credibility and inauthentic behavior, which boosts posts and content. And then there are these other kind of more really psychological experiences, which one of them is the illusory truth effect. The notion that it's really hard to debunk things. So a few years ago, there was a study done which gave people headlines that were both true and false. And they said whether they thought it was true or false. And when people were shown the same headline a second time, irrespective of whether they had identified it as true or false the first time, the second time they saw it, they were more likely to say it was true. It's almost like this brain shortcut. And inside of our minds, we somehow feel like the more often we see something, the more likely it is to be true. One of the lines is, every time a lie is repeated, it seems more plausible, which is super relevant for all of you because it is incredibly difficult to debunk misinformation. And when you're dealing with your communities, if you have the opportunity to do that, and we're going to get into how you do it, part of what you have to keep in mind is how you work around the illusory truth effect. That simply put, people believe lies more often than they see them. And there's a cumulative effect. I mean, we've seen over the years now of our former president and other allies of his, of Donald Trump's, sowing discord, laying the groundwork for what became known as the big lie that the election was stolen, that all of this sort of built on itself as a narrative. And then the final piece is confirmation bias, the notion that, we like what we believe, and we often seek out information and news coverage that confirms our own standpoint. So it isn't a bad thing. I think sometimes people say, oh, well, everyone has confirmation bias. Yeah, we do. We all come to the world with a set of assumptions and beliefs. We live now in ecosystems. Recent research from an outlet called The Markup showed how siloed people's online communities are. We seek out what we like. It's human behavior. It's why we have friends and why we gravitate to different things. But when it comes to information and the ecosystems online, we're really crafting so much of a bubble, and it's hard to get out of that often, if you are in a bubble that promotes and sows disinformation, it can be incredibly hard to unpack that for people. Hannah, can we go to the next slide? And I think, I want to sort of just kind of step back and put some context here around what we've been seeing as an organization at PEN America, which is that this is not new. And I think our partners here today, and all of you will probably feel that intuitively. There's been disinformation, coordinated ways that words are used, language gets crafted, narratives are created and promoted to sway people. I think in a word that can be called propaganda. And that has existed for centuries all over the world. But with the advent of the digital age, the proliferation of this content and the ability for people to access it so widely and so quickly is a major issue in society. It permeates, as Brad mentioned, Ruben, David mentioned, every aspect of our lives now. And we saw last year when we first went into lockdown, which is, I think, almost exactly a year ago, we saw so much vaccine mis and disinformation, claims about a variety of things, whether it was, if you recall, that if you were to wear a mask, it activates coronavirus in your mouth. Some have said that if you gargle with saline, it'll cure coronavirus. That was a year ago. There are now new conspiracy theories that if you get the vaccine, it is really Microsoft planting a chip inside of you. There are so many ways that this permeates. There are also instances we saw last summer around protests, and that often people, believed a certain thing. They saw an isolated photograph or video, and it turned out that videos were miscaptioned. People were using protests from different countries, different years, different cities, captioning them saying, this is happening in X city, like my city. And it would lead me, Nora, to believe a whole set of things about what was going on regarding the racial justice protests of 2020. All of that sort of predicated on ways that the internet played on and manipulated how we understand situations. And then finally, of course, we know what has happened over the last many months around election mis and disinformation. So this really sets a tone for us where we can't simply look at an isolated example. We can't just say, and I don't think your work will really benefit from only looking at a small, tiny example of mis or disinformation. We have to look at the larger ecosystem here, that so much of what someone might believe about, let's say, vaccines is also kind of supported by a whole other array of things they're doing. It depends on where they're getting their news source. It depends on what they thought, let's say, of who's involved in different types of election fraud, which can then inform how they view or trust their doctor and the medical community. It's all interwoven. So if we keep going to the next slide, we want to start just sort of laying out for you some of the things we're seeing on the ground. And I think, as communities, mostly of color, in Florida, a lot of our partners here, we've spoken, I am Latina, we've also spoken with partners who have really kind of grappled with the way that Latino, Spanish speaking, and bilingual communities in Florida were targeted this last election cycle with mis and disinformation. We're just grappling with what we know about racialized disinformation. And that whether it is Black communities in headlines being targeted with election and health misinformation, whether it is headlines that Native Americans are being targeted, I think there's just an interesting reflection for us here as a group to think about how much that weighs on communities of color primarily. And the idea that for some reason we have to grapple with yet another challenge. Part of what our work tries to do at PEN America is recast the narrative and empower communities, empower leaders like you guys to think about, how do you build power in your communities? How do you recast the headline, so to speak, and try to kind of, instead of focusing on the vulnerability of Latino communities, Black communities, Native American, and other people of color, how do we actually think of ways that we come together, that we call people in and discuss values and what our beliefs are, as one of the mechanisms to actually become better digitally literate? So I'll turn it back to Hannah to kind of go through some of these examples. But for us, really top of mind is not just what we're seeing, but how it's affecting communities and how we overcome that in ways where we do proactive programming. And so today is really one of those efforts where we are seeking to help give you all opportunity to brainstorm and have these solutions, whether it's how to fact check things or how to talk with other people who are susceptible.
Yeah, so you all, especially those of you who are, tuning in from Florida, know the misinfo trends in Florida better than we do. We're just going to lay out a couple trends that we've seen online, as most people are getting their information these days, and kind of come up with later on in the discussion some ways that you can respond to community members if you see folks sharing this kind of information in an empathetic way. And I really encourage everybody to be thinking about throughout the rest of this session, what are some trends that you've seen yourself that we can discuss and bring to the table for like a group brainstorming, like Nora was mentioning. So, and you'll notice in some of these trends that we've seen, they are directly preying upon some of the values that people hold close that are then taken advantage of. So for example, we've been seeing reports of faith leaders spreading misinformation about how the vaccine includes microchips that track people, preying upon religious beliefs, false claims that vaccines are made from the tissue of aborted fetuses, and calling it the mark of the beast. I think it's really important to remember, and again, we'll talk about this a little later as well, but it's important to remember that this is poking beliefs that people hold dear, and to use that as a way to come to the table of these conversations with a lot of compassion and understanding for why somebody might be inclined to believe this, their emotions, their confirmation biases. That information for you as organizers is going to be a really powerful idea to keep in mind as you approach these conversations. It's also, some of these reports we continue to hear a lot about. Private messaging services like WhatsApp, Spanish language, like radio shows, for example, spreading QAnon conspiracy theories and false border immigration narratives. These are, we don't want to overdo it, but we do want to, we'll talk about the truth sandwich technique in a little bit here, but it's always good to come at this from a perspective of, okay, we're gonna address it, but we're not gonna continue to spread it because we don't want to ignore it, but we want to bring to the fore the true information as a counter to the myths that we're seeing.
One thing I'll just add is a term that we hear a lot, which is that misinformation is really, and disinformation is playing on wedge issues, the issues that are likely to be most politicized. And if you look at the list here of these trends, just in Florida, questions around aborted fetuses, that plays on an incredible wedge issue of abortion. If you look at, immigration narratives and the border issues that we've seen, that plays on immigration, of course, which is another huge wedge issue. The kinds of things that can literally divide people, where Hannah and I might otherwise come together, have dialogue, maybe disagree on things, but still be able to kind of connect. What these issues do is often create such a wedge that the gulf between us really can't be crossed. And it's those instances for you all to just be aware of and reflect on, and then think about how you proactively address them.
So just a couple other very recent examples of disinformation narratives that are playing on some of these other trends, or some of these other, psychological factors. You see this medical racism. This is a documentary that it was co-produced by an anti-vaccine activist, Robert Kennedy Jr. And, again, preying upon these ideas that people, especially anti-vaxxers, believe. And we also have like narratives like this. You see this screenshot of the gas prices, about rising gas prices that have, resurfaced on social media. This is a great example of doctored images and how they can really tap into people's false assumptions about what the pandemic is doing, or, why it might be peaking or not. And whose fault it is. So this example especially is, both of these examples are good to keep in mind in terms of how easy it is to manipulate images and videos, and how quickly the false information can travel on the internet. And again, playing into people's ideas that are already existing, like anti-vaccination conversations and ideologies.
So I think, given one time, we kind of want to move into thinking about what you all can really do as organizers and activists in your organizations and in communities. And I think there are a couple of ways that we, at least at Penn, bifurcate, though these are of course related and must happen concurrently. One, I think there are ways that you as individuals help adapt your own digital practices. Each of us has to be able to feel empowered. We should be curating our news feeds, make sure that we are fact checking the things we see, whether it is from communities that we're working with or other news we come into contact with. It's really kind of just an individual experience. And that is really work that we do in our trainings when we work for 90 minutes at a time with people on what their practices are, helping to adapt their digital techniques, how they're thinking about fact checking things, what fact checking resources they use. That's one piece of the work. And then I think the other piece of the work is like, as you are doing that, how are you actually communicating with others about these narratives? And this, we've worked a little bit with Reframe, which is an amazing organization, empowering and sort of giving tools to organizers. Of course, we've been working and speaking with our partners here in this workshop around some of this. I think there is no silver bullet. There is not going to be an easy answer where we give you all of the ways that you can help triage this situation. The instances in my own personal life where I work with organizers and where I work with people who are falling for misinformation, it takes a long time. What we always say is truth takes time. And when you work with people, there are elements of this that are incredibly one-on-one, very personalized, no single experience of working with someone to help them understand and kind of come back from whether it's extremism or conspiracy theories. None of that really can be something that you iterate with copy and paste. And I hope that that's just an opening for us to have a discussion of how you are experiencing this and what you've learned, what you're doing that you think is useful. Much of what we have found is who is communicating what. Messengers are critical in this. So is language. And part of what we've outlined here is just sort of the beginning of ways that you can help identify who are the trusted voices in your community. How do you share information for people who might be susceptible? how do you also work with some of those trusted voices? Some of those could be faith leaders. Of course, the delicate issue is that often faith leaders can they themselves be vectors of mis and disinformation. So we're looking for people who can help disseminate messaging that communities just inherently reflexively turn to. If you're in a college community, it could be some professors or people on campuses that have sway and cachet in their community. If it is communities, that have a certain bend towards local media, who are some of those journalists that when they share things, people really turn to them and believe it? Because there's a lot of this going back to the emotionality of why we're susceptible. We can't help but just naturally react to what we see. And often we'll believe the people that we trust the most. It's those people then, including you all, that have this kind of incumbent responsibility to be really careful about how you're explaining things and what you share. And one of the techniques we often turn to is the truth sandwich, which is really trying to frame the conversation when it comes to a false set of facts around that false fact with truth. To be able to bring people in to talk with them about, well, here is the reality of something, here is the false piece of information, and again, here is sort of a more factual basis for believing something. I think if we go to the next slide, one of the things we're cautious about is that in the middle of all of that, just telling people what the facts are or that truth is X, Y, and Z doesn't help. It never works. And I believe this is where the rubber meets the road. The conversations you are having with people when they in real time are shifting their own beliefs and attitudes. We have to be able to sort of bring people in and work with them on what they're thinking, why they believe what they do. And so we've built out over the last year a kind of toolkit for how you can begin implementing media literacy skills in your lives, and then how you can help bring that to other people. So I feel like based on time, we should probably open it up and really hear from you guys. We spotlighted the presentation here, but I'd love to just sort of hear from everyone in the room. If we were in a physical room, we could of course really hear and gauge the room, but I'd love to open it up. I think one of the questions that we had in mind was really to kick it off, what misinformation have you encountered in your work? And then have you had any effective conversations with people, bringing them back from whatever they've been susceptible to?